This is lecture number 16 in the Riparian Function and Management course. This will be lecture RM6, Riparian Grazing Management. I'm Steve Nelly. I will be leading this lecture. In Texas, there are approximately 191,000 miles of creeks and rivers. Most of these run through rangeland. They run through private ranches. Most of these riparian areas exist on grazed and livestock production areas. So you can see how livestock can have a big impact on the health and stability and function of riparian areas. And so grazing management is one of the most important considerations for grazing management in Texas. We need to remember that old cow, a 1,000-pound cow, she's eating about 30 pounds of forage every day. That's on a dry weight basis. That computes to nearly 11,000 pounds of grass in a year. So you can see that one cow can even have a pretty significant impact based on the amount of forage she requires. And the way that riparian areas are grazed and managed determines whether a riparian area looks like that or whether it looks more like that. Grazing management determines whether a riparian area looks like this or whether it looks like this, or whether it looks like this, where the tallest sedge we could find was grazed down to 2 or 3 inches. Grazing determines whether a riparian area looks like this or like this. So you can clearly see that grazing can either degrade or it can restore riparian areas. Grazing is neither good nor bad. Livestock is neither good nor bad in a riparian area. It's how the livestock are managed that determines whether the result is good or bad. We've seen many examples in the western states and in Texas how grazing management can restore degraded riparian areas with nothing else except a change in the way livestock are managed. Riparian areas can go from non-functional to proper functioning condition. So how can overgrazed riparian areas be restored? Well, first, it requires that the manager has some basic understanding of creeks and rivers and riparian areas and how they work, and understands something about this interrelationship between the water and the soil and the vegetation. Obviously, when we think about grazing management, it's the vegetation that we have the most control over in that riparian area. And so just to review, these are the key functions or purposes of riparian vegetation. It helps to dissipate the energy. Think of a high flow event. Think of a flood moving through that valley. It helps to reduce erosion and stabilize the banks. It helps to trap sediment, and it helps to build and enlarge that riparian sponge. It helps to store water in that riparian area. So basically we could boil it down to this. The job of vegetation in the riparian area is to slow down the water, giving it time to spread out, giving it time to soak into the ground. That's what the riparian manager is really doing, is helping to slow down the water. So the rancher or the livestock producer that has riparian areas on his ranch, when he sees something like this, what he should see is energy dissipation, first and foremost, and stability. And then only secondly should he look at that and think forage. So the most important function of that vegetation is riparian stability, and secondly, its value as livestock forage. Riparian areas are at least 3 to 5 times more productive than the adjacent uplands. In some cases, maybe 10 times more productive. You can see why livestock would want to hang out in the riparian areas, and you can see why, if they're not well managed, the riparian areas could become to look something like that: degraded, overgrazed, lacking in good vegetation. Much of the information I will cover is found in these two publications, which are put out by the National Riparian Service Team. They're both available to you if you want to add them to your library. The one on the left from 1997 is called TR14. Its revision from 2006 is called TR20. I would recommend you get these publications to help you understand a little bit more about grazing management. These publications are geared more toward the western states. You're going to find them not quite as applicable to Texas as we might wish, but there's a lot of good information in these publications. I want to show you a series of photos of some creeks. I believe they're from Wyoming, just to show you visually how nicely riparian areas respond to a change in grazing management. So this is Clear Creek, May of 2001, exact same creek 5 years later. Let me go back and do that again. 2001, 2006, a change in grazing management. Same creek, different location, September of 2000. 5 years later, an amazing difference. Notice the fence on the far side of the creek, which allows livestock to be managed. Same creek, different location, September 2000. 5 years later, an amazing transformation when the way that livestock are grazed is changed. Same creek, September 2000. 5 years later, or 6 years later, again, notice the fence on the far side that allows that area to be managed. September 2000, 6 years later. Let me go back and do that again. It's quite an amazing change in the kinds and amounts of vegetation. Different creek, French Creek, August 2000. 6 years later, it almost looks like a different place on the planet. So grazing makes a huge difference in how these creeks look and how they function. Wolf Creek, April 1993, pretty dismal image. And then I believe it's 13 years later, different kind of management. We can see that riparian areas do respond to how livestock are grazed. And I think it's pretty obvious to all of us that vegetation is really the key to functional riparian areas. Riparian areas have different kinds of vegetation, and livestock eat all of these. They eat sedges and rushes and grasses and forbs and weeds and vines and shrubs and trees. So all of these types of vegetation can be a part of livestock forage, and they all need to be managed to be able to maintain good function. You need to become familiar with the two functional groups of riparian plants in your area, both the colonizing plants and the stabilizing plants. I believe you've already been exposed to what those terms mean. And you need to know the names and be able to identify the important species in your area. Not just the name of the plant, in this case knotgrass, but what is its stability rating? SR6, on a scale of 1 to 10. And whether it's a facultative wetland plant or an obligate plant. In most range management plant ID courses, they don't teach much about riparian plants, and they don't teach much about sedges and rushes. But you need to know what these plants look like and the role that they play in the riparian area. And that's where your field guide is going to be very important to you, to learn the name of these plants, what is their stability rating, what is their wetland indicator. So I urge you to spend some time with your field guide and learn what these grasses and sedges look like. Here's emery sedge, stability rating of 9. And you need to know the important woody plants that grow in the riparian area and what their stability rating is and what they look like. So please take advantage of that field guide. There's also some very impressive data that has been collected on the rooting characteristics of plants. And this graph shows a comparison of upland plants to riparian plants. And this is the number of miles of root in 1 cubic foot of soil. And what this data indicates is how much more densely rooted riparian plants are compared to upland plants. Notice here that we see that riparian plants are 10, 20, and even 30 times more densely rooted than the plants that grow in the uplands. And it's pretty hard to imagine that a sedge or a grass might have 18 or 20 or more miles of root in 1 cubic foot, but that's what it takes to hold those banks together. This data is similar, but this is root mass. This is the number of pounds of roots per acre. And again, it's a comparison between upland plants and riparian plants, and we see how much more tonnage of root material is underground with riparian plants. And so you'll notice that knot grass is 12 tons of root per acre. Deer grass muley, which grows in the Trans-Pecos, over 30 tons of root per acre. And so we see the different rooting characteristics of riparian plants. So let's look at some images of what happens when we try to manage livestock in a riparian area. So let's imagine this as a 1,000 acre pasture, and you've made a determination that this 1,000 acre pasture should safely support 30 animal units, so we'll say 30 cows. And so there's a creek running through this pasture, and it's the only water source. Now, how many of you believe that when you turn those 30 cows loose in that pasture, they're going to evenly distribute themselves across that 1,000 acres? Well, if you've been around cows very much, you know that they're going to tend to congregate down along the riparian area. Cattle like to stay down by the creek, at least during parts of the year. So that the greatest challenge in managing grazing in a riparian area is to overcoming this disproportional grazing, overcoming this instinct that livestock have for hanging around down near the water in the creek area. And we know that that's their instinct. There's nothing wrong with it. That's just how cows are wired. They like to hang out where there's water, where there's grass, where there's shade, where they can get some thermal regulation. Just like you and I like to hang out in the creek, so do livestock. And having to overcome that instinct with our management is what we're trying to do. So what if the manager says, okay, I'm going to cut cow numbers in half. We're going to go down to 15 cows instead of 30. Will that solve the problem? And we can see that in most cases that will not solve the problem, because you still have those livestock want to hang out down by the creek for the same reasons we just mentioned. And what if we cut animal numbers by 75%? Will that solve the problem of disproportional grazing? And again, the answer is no, because a majority of those animals are still going to spend a lot of their time down by the creek. There's still disproportional grazing, even with very few head of livestock. So one of the important things to remember about riparian grazing management is that it only takes a few head to keep a bad riparian area in bad condition. Always remember that. So one of the things that is often suggested is that if the cattle are having to water in the creek, then perhaps it would be a good idea to establish some alternate water development at least a half mile away from the creek. And this is often recommended, and sometimes this helps to redistribute grazing. Perhaps some of those cows would just as soon walk up on the hill and water out of a windmill or a trough if you provide alternate water development. Now, sometimes it works. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't work at all, but it's something worth trying to see if you can lure or entice those cows away from the creek area. But we know that there's still going to be this tendency during certain seasons to hang out in the creek, so this is usually not the final answer, but it might help. Another thing that is sometimes recommended, and it's a good idea, is to move the locations where you put your salt, mineral, where you feed hay, where you put out supplement. Instead of doing that down by the creek, move those locations out away, at least a half mile from the creek. Again, you're just trying to entice and lure those animals away from spending so much time in the riparian area. And sometimes this is somewhat effective. But again, it's very hard to overcome that tendency of cattle to hang out down by the creek, especially during certain seasons of the year. So a better solution, and perhaps the solution that most ranchers would aim towards, is to establish a separate riparian pasture, to do some cross fencing, which would allow a grazing rotation where all 30 cows would be moved systematically, periodically among the pastures. And at first, if that riparian area needs to be rested for 1 or 2 or 3 years to jumpstart that vegetation, you could skip over the riparian area and still wouldn't be sacrificing the whole pasture worth of grazing. And then at whatever time you determine that that riparian area can be safely grazed, you put the herd in the creek pasture and you leave them for whatever period of time is appropriate, not to overgraze it, before you put them back in the upland pastures. So this is a really good way to be able to protect and manage and maintain a riparian pasture. The next step above that would be then to subdivide the riparian pasture into even smaller pastures where livestock could graze for a shorter period of time and allows a longer rest period. And perhaps in this example here, each of those small riparian pastures could be providing as much forage as one of the larger upland pastures because of the increased production. This is exactly the strategy that was used to restore Bear Creek in Central Oregon. You've seen those pictures of how this creek came back in a pretty short period of time. Bear Creek was fenced off into 3 separate riparian pastures, and those cattle are grazed in each pasture for only about 2.5 weeks between mid-February and mid-April. And then the rest of the year, they go up onto the uplands, giving the Bear Creek vegetation a chance to recover. The next step beyond that gets pretty intensive, but we will see ranchers begin to create lots and lots of smaller pastures. Don't have to be pie-shaped pastures, but oftentimes it's done that way for water access. And then putting sub-pastures even within that riparian pasture. And perhaps you're thinking, this is crazy, no one would do that. But this is the trend we see in the more progressive grazing managers, and perhaps even putting cross fences down across the creek, creating small riparian sub-pastures. And in this way, livestock can be managed with the highest amount of flexibility from one pasture to the next, skipping those pastures that need extra rest. And oftentimes this is done with electric fencing, sometimes even movable fencing. And there are more and more ranchers, serious ranchers, doing this on their ranches, both in the uplands and in the riparian areas. And they're doing it successfully ecologically, they're improving their ranch resources, and they're doing it successfully financially, making more money. One example of this is the Bannister Ranch in eastern Montana. This is described in one of the publications we mentioned, where they have 38 pastures. They typically graze about 240 cows, and the average grazing period in those 38 pastures is 3 weeks, and they only graze a pasture every other year. So what it amounts to is that every pasture on the ranch, including the riparian pastures, are grazed for only about 3 weeks, and then they're rested for nearly 2 years. And you can imagine the kind of recovery that a pasture would make being grazed for such a short period of time and then rested. Another example is the famous Deseret Ranch in Utah. It's a very large ranch. They have 100 pastures, and each pasture only gets grazed one time per year, several days, followed by a year of rest. And this is becoming the way that more and more ranchers are managing not only their riparian areas, but their entire ranches. It requires a commitment and some dedication by the cowboys and the managers, but this is the trend for more and more livestock producers. Some of the key principles to keep in mind with riparian grazing management, and you perhaps have heard this before, but consider that riparian areas are special places. They need specialized management. They need preferential management. You cannot manage the riparian area the same way as you do the uplands. They're different, they're special. They need specialized management. For many ranches, it's a good idea to consider grazing the riparian area during the dormant season. Physiologically, you cannot hurt a plant by grazing it during the dormant season. There's no green photosynthetic leaf. You can't really hurt a plant. Now, that doesn't mean you want to graze these areas to the ground. You still want to leave a stubble, which provides energy dissipation for spring floods, but you won't hurt riparian plants. You won't hurt the root system. You won't hurt the vigor of the plant by grazing it in the wintertime. However, you do have to be careful with that strategy because in some cases, riparian plants are green in the wintertime. So here's emery sedge. This is in mid-February, and so you can see it's actively growing. So be careful and understand the plants you have and whether they're truly dormant or whether some of them are actually growing in the wintertime too. Another principle generally applicable to most cases is a light to moderate grazing followed by a long recovery period. Now, in this particular picture, that sedge is not grazed lightly. It's actually more like moderate and maybe even a little bit beyond moderate grazing, but you get the idea of light to moderate use followed by long recovery is a good way to think about managing riparian areas and riparian pastures. This is a riparian pasture along the Concho River near San Angelo. This pasture was rested for several years to jumpstart the vegetation and restore good plant cover. And then after that period of time, when it had recovered, they began to graze it carefully. They put 75, it was actually grown heifers, in this pasture for 2.5 weeks in September. And what you see there is the grazing use on eastern gamma grass after 2.5 weeks. And you can see they didn't hurt the plant at all. They grazed it, but they didn't hurt it at all. We were surprised that those cattle actually seemed to prefer grazing emery sedge, even in preference to eastern gamma grass. But with a long recovery period, the sedges are going to recover. And this is what the area looked like after that grazing period. You can see it's definitely not been hammered or overgrazed, but with a long recovery period, those sedges will grow back, and perhaps the next time they graze it, they'll want to change a few things. Maybe not graze it quite so long, or maybe a different season of the year. I suppose you've seen this image, which shows the relationship of leaf removal to the health of the root system. And one key principle in riparian grazing is that the frequency and severity of the grazing defoliation is what determines the health of the root system. So if you want to maintain a healthy, deep, binding root system to hold those banks together, then the way that those plants are grazed is what determines the health of that root system. This image comes from the Cows and Fish Project, which is put on by the Alberta Riparian Group. I urge you to look them up on the internet. They have some good riparian resources. But the idea is to alternate between an ungrazed rested plant and a grazed plant. So you graze it, then you rest it, and you go back and forth between those two types of plants never getting to the point of overgrazing. And you can see what happens to the root system of these plants if they're grazed too hard, too intensely, or too frequently. Obviously, livestock also browse woody plants more than what we think, but we also want to pay good attention to the browsing of young trees. On the left, we see a young cypress tree. On the right, a young cypress, and that's not what young trees are supposed to look like. So we got to be paying attention to not just grasses and sedges, but what are the livestock doing to the woody plants. And of course, this browsing can be done by livestock and or wildlife. And so another one of the principles is that even if your grazing is perfectly managed, wildlife can and often do undermine riparian recovery. So you may have to also become heavily involved in managing wildlife populations, whether it's native white-tailed deer, whether it's exotic axis deer. If you're up in the mountains, it's going to be elk. In the north, it could be moose. But these wild ungulates can have a tremendous effect on the riparian area. And they're going to need to be incorporated into your management strategy. This sad picture is a tributary of the Frio River, and there's no livestock grazing in this area. The damage that you see is caused by an overpopulation of axis deer. So even if the grazing is done perfectly, this management is going to require a very aggressive management of axis deer. It's always something to keep in mind. In most cases, livestock exclusion is one of the ways in which you can manage and restore riparian vegetation. Again, we said earlier that livestock are neither good nor bad. It's how they're managed that makes the difference. And so some landowners and ranchers have just agreed to fence out the riparian area and not graze it. And that's an option for them. And if they're okay with it, then that's a good way to manage riparian areas. Riparian areas do not need to be grazed. There's no ecological reason why grazing is necessary. They can recover and do just fine without any livestock grazing. There are some incentive programs to help landowners manage riparian areas, and one of them is offered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's called the Riparian Buffer Program, and this is a program in which landowners would enroll with their local field office to help them construct riparian fencing, to help them provide the alternate livestock water. And under this particular program, there's an initial period of 10 years of no grazing, and there are some pretty lucrative financial incentives and compensations for this program. So taxpayers are helping with incentives to help some landowners help restore these riparian areas. So don't overlook the possibility of receiving some assistance to do some of these things. Another principle to remember is that there's no cookbook recipes of the right way to graze a riparian area. Just because something worked at Bear Creek or on some other ranch doesn't mean you should necessarily mimic that exact system. Be flexible, be adaptive, try to find out what works good for your situation, and always be looking for good solutions that are practical and workable in your situation. This sad picture is the way that many riparian areas looked 100 years ago. This picture was taken on the South Concho River, the headwaters of the South Concho in the early 1900s. And it shows what was perhaps the predominant way that most riparian areas looked during that era. But thankfully, due to good stewardship practices of landowners, this is what that same area looks like today. Completely restored, highly functional, and providing good habitat, good grazing, good fish habitat, and all the things we're looking for. But it's important just to realize that even a simple change in grazing management in creeks will begin to heal up. It doesn't take as long as 100 years. It begins to happen rather quickly, 3, 4, 5 years. They begin to heal up, and with good management, they continue to get better and better. It has been said that those who do not understand nature are destined to deplete it. And we see evidence of that all across Texas and the Southwest. It's true on uplands, it's true in riparian areas, but the good news is that those who understand nature best, are compelled to conserve it, to take care of it, not because they're forced to, or not because it's regulated, it's because they want to and because they understand the benefits of taking care of land, of taking care of riparian areas. So this is simply a picture of a workshop that we had on a ranch near here, trying to teach landowners some of these principles that you've been exposed to today, knowing that many people will do the responsible thing and begin to take care of riparian areas once they understand how they should be managed. And so I'll end with this image here of a manager on a large ranch in South Texas. This gentleman was raised on this ranch from a boy on San Ambrosio Creek. He said this is where they used to go to hunt arrowheads. The area was overgrazed and was barren, and they could go out there and find arrowheads. But as this gentleman grew up on that ranch and became the manager, and he changed the way that cattle are grazed on this ranch, the riparian area began to respond, begin to grow dense vegetation, begin to trap sediment. And so there's no way you could ever find an arrowhead here now. It's densely vegetated and the banks are good and stable. So thanks to land stewards like this and many others, we're seeing better and better riparian conditions and improving riparian function because of this stewardship ethic and because of the good management being applied by ranchers and private landowners. So this concludes lecture number 16 about riparian grazing management.